I had a brief moment to speak to Jojo upstairs, and she was a journalist for 10 years. She is an acclaimed British novelist, but she has a very interesting background. She has been a Braille typist, and she was a minicab controller. And I said, what's a minicab controller? I'm thinking my 6-year-old son, would love to watch her do these cars. She goes, oh no, that's when, prior to Uber X in London, we had these cars that needed to, taxis that had to get dispatched, and my job was at 4 a.m. to dispatch cars to people coming out of bars. And I said, wow, that must have been some good fodder for your literary background. She goes, well, it certainly gave me an insight into human nature at 4 in the morning. So she is one of the few 2-time winners of the Romantic Novel Association Romantic Novel of the Year. She has written dozens of books. She's been translated into 11 languages, and her latest book, After You, offers fans kind of a homey and heartfelt sequel to the New York Times bestseller, Me Before You, which apparently Oprah had called an unlikely love story to be devoured like candy in between tears. So please join me in welcoming Jojo Moyes with her newest book.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yep, okay, great. Thank you all for making it out on such a wet evening. I got a full experience of Boston and Philly weather when I flew over here this morning. I won't be doing that again in a hurry. Before I start, I'd just like to say a couple of things about libraries, because it's a subject very close to my heart. I grew up in a fairly rough inner city area of London, and my parents didn't have a huge amount of money, but what they did give me was a library card. And the thing that I worked out as a bit of a bookworm of a child very early was that little slip of yellow card actually gave me a doorway into a million different worlds and a million different lives. And I'm sure the spurs to my imagination that came from having this unlimited access to books in my childhood is what got me to Philly today. In England, we are losing the battle to keep our libraries, and it breaks my heart and a lot of other writers' hearts, because what it does is it divides people into haves and have-nots when it comes to books, and that should not exist, because even in the poorest and roughest of households, the thing that a book can teach you, which almost nothing else can if you don't have that kind of parent, is it teaches you empathy. It teaches you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And in a world that's kind of tough, that could teach you to be tough, the thing that you can learn from that is the key to us being a kinder society, really. So I'm not going to go on about it, but one thing did strike me was that if you think of the guiding principles of libraries, which is that knowledge is for the greater good, and also the element of trust involved, which is we're going to give you a free book. We're going to give you maybe 4, 5, 6, 11 books, and we're going to trust you to bring them back to us. If you can imagine a government trying to suggest setting that up today, it's pretty hard. So I think it's all the more important, just as a society, that we keep those fundamental principles going. Anyway, I'm not going to kind of rattle on too long. What I am going to do is do you a short reading from my new book, and then talk a little bit about how it came about. And then I'm really, really hoping that some of you will ask me some questions, because if I stand up here talking to myself for too long, it makes me look a bit weird. Anyway. Okay. So After You picks up 18 months after the end of Me Before You. And before I say anything else, anybody who doesn't know the ending to Me Before You, can you just stick your hand up? Okay, that's a few. Right, I'm going to have to be quite careful. It may give a little bit of the plot away to say that this reading opens in a grief counselling group. I'm sorry. Okay, but you don't know why she's there. She could be visiting. So anyway. My name is Natasha, and I lost my husband to cancer 3 years ago. On a humid Monday night, the members of the Moving On Circle sat in a ring of orange office chairs in the Pentecostal church hall, alongside Mark, the leader, a tall, mustachioed man whose whole being exuded a kind of exhausted melancholy, and one empty chair. I'm Fred. My wife Jilly died in September. She was 74. Sunil. My twin brother died of leukemia 2 years ago. William. Dead father, 6 months ago. All a bit ridiculous, frankly, because we never really got on when he was alive. I keep asking myself why I'm here. There was a peculiar scent to grief, it turned out. It smelled of damp, imperfectly ventilated church halls and poor quality tea bags. It smelled of meals for one and stale cigarettes smoked hunched against the cold, of spritzed hair and armpits, little practical victories against a morass of despair. That smell alone told me I did not belong here, whatever I had promised Dad. I felt like a fraud. Plus, they all looked so sad. I shifted uneasily in my seat and Mark caught me. He nodded and gave me a reassuring smile. We know, the smile said. We have been here before. I bet you haven't, I responded silently. Sorry I'm late. The door opened, letting in a blast of warm air, and the empty chair was taken by a mop-headed teenager who folded his limbs into place like they were always somehow too long for the space they were in. Jake, you missed last week. Everything okay? Sorry, Dad messed up at work and he couldn't get here. Don't worry, it's good you made it. The boy glanced round the room from under his long fringe, hesitating slightly when his gaze landed on my glittery skirt. I pulled my bag onto my lap in an attempt to hide it, and he looked away. Hello, dear, I'm Daphne. My husband took his own life. I don't think it was the nagging. The woman's half laugh seemed to leak pain. She patted her carefully set hair and looked down awkwardly at her knees. We were happy. We were. The boy's hands were tucked under his thighs. Jake, my mum, 2 years ago. I've been coming here for the past year because my dad can't deal with it and I needed someone to talk to. How is your dad this week? Said Mark. Oh, not bad. I mean, he brought a woman home last Friday night, but he didn't sit on the sofa and cry afterward, so that's something. Jake's father is handling grief in his own way, Mark said in my direction. Shagging, said Jake. Mostly shagging. I wish I was younger, said Fred wistfully. He was wearing a tie, the kind of man who considers himself undressed without one. I think that would have been a marvellous way to handle Jilly dying. My cousin picked up a man at my aunt's funeral, said a woman in the corner who might have been called Leanne. I couldn't remember. Actually, during the funeral. Oh, no, she said they went to a travelodge after the sandwiches. She shrugged. It's the heightened emotions, apparently. I was in the wrong place. I could see that now. Surreptitiously, I began to gather my belongings, wondering whether I should just announce my leaving or run. And then Mark turned to me and smiled expectantly. I looked blankly at him. He raised his eyebrows. Oh, me? Actually, I was just leaving. I mean, I don't think I'm... Oh, everyone wants to leave on their first day, dear. I wanted to leave on my second and third, too. Oh, that's just the biscuits. I keep telling Mark we should have better biscuits. Just tell us the bare bones of it, if you like. Don't worry, you're among friends. They were all looking, waiting. I realised I couldn't run. I hunched back into my seat. Okay, well, my name's Louisa, and the man I loved died at 35. There were a few nods of sympathy around the room. When did this happen, Louisa? 20 months ago, and a week, and 2 days. 3 years, 2 weeks, and 2 days. Natasha smiled at me from across the room. There was a low murmur of commiseration. Daphne beside me reached out a plump, beringed hand and patted my leg. We've had many discussions in this room about the particular difficulties when someone dies young, said Mark. How long were you together? Little less than 6 months. There were a few hidden looks of surprise. That's quite brief, a voice said. I'm sure Louisa's pain is just as valid, said Mark smoothly. And how did he pass, Louisa? Pass what? Die, said Fred helpfully. He took his own life. That must have been a great shock. Oh, not really. I knew he was planning it. There is a peculiar sort of silence, it turns out, when you tell a room full of people who think they know everything there is to know about the death of a loved one, that they don't. I took a breath. I knew he wanted to do it before I met him. I tried to change his mind and I couldn't, so I went along with it because I loved him and it seemed to make sense at the time, and now it makes a lot less sense, which is, why I'm here. Oh, death never makes sense, said Daphne. Unless you're Buddhist, said Natasha. I keep trying to think Buddhist thoughts, but I'm worried that Olaf is going to come back as a mouse or something and I'm going to poison him. She sighed. I have to put poison down. We have a terrible mouse problem in our block. Oh, you'll never get rid of them. They're like fleas, said Sunil. For everyone you see, there are hundreds of them behind the scenes. You might want to think about what you're doing, Natasha love, said Daphne. There could be hundreds of little Olafs running around. My Alan could be one of them. You could be poisoning the both of them. Well, said Fred, if it's Buddhist, it'd just come back as something else, wouldn't it? But what if it's a fly or something and Natasha kills that too? Oh, I'd hate to come back as a fly, said William. Horrible, hairy, black things, he shuddered. I'm not like some mass murderer, said Natasha. You're making it sound like I'm out there slaughtering everyone's reincarnated husbands. Well, that mouse might be someone's husband, even if it isn't Olaf. I think we should steer this session back on track, said Mark, rubbing his temple. Louisa, it's brave of you to come and tell us your story. Why don't you tell us a bit more about how you and, what was his name? How you met? You're in a circle of trust here. We have all pledged that these stories go no further than these walls. It was at this point that I happened to catch Jake's eye. He glanced at Daphne and then at me and shook his head subtly. I met him at work, I said, and his name was Bill. Thanks. Thank you. So I don't know whether, given that there's a high proportion of people who haven't read Me Before You, whether I should just explain a very little of what that book was about. But Me Before You was a book that I wrote back in 2009. It came out here at the beginning of 2012. And it's a book about a man who was a master of the universe, a very wealthy young man, handsome, good-looking, the kind of man who nauseatingly has the world at his feet. He lived a big life. He had a beautiful girlfriend. He took adventure holidays. You know, he was one of these people who kind of sucks the marrow out of life. And in a brief kind of random accident, he's hit by a motorcycle and he's left quadriplegic. And we meet him 2 years after the accident, and he is ill-suited, as anybody would be, to being quadriplegic, but spectacularly ill-suited to leading any kind of interior life. And he's very angry, and he decides that he's going to end his life. And it's the story of his relationship with Lou, who is a small-town girl who takes the job as his carer, really, because she can't get anything else, and doesn't like him at first. She's hired on a 6-month contract, and then a couple of months into this contract, she discovers what he plans to do, and she decides she's going to change his mind through a series of adventures. And I wrote this book after hearing a news story when I was driving my kids home from school about a young rugby player. For those of you who don't know rugby, it's like a much less glamorous version of American football, sort of fewer teeth and more mud. I couldn't get this story out of my head. I couldn't understand how parents would agree to take their own child to end his life. And because I'm an ex-journalist, I just had to find out more. And the more I read up about this family, the more I could see that they were in an impossible position. And in my own life at the time, we were dealing with 2 relatives who required 24-hour care to stay alive. And one of the things that situation teaches you, if you like, is that it's very hard to hold on to a moral absolute when you're looking at someone who is suffering every day. And what we had in our family were 2 people who medical science was keeping alive, but we could offer them no quality of life at all, no joy, no dignity, no reprieve from the situation that they were in. And so I decided I wanted to write this book, and my own career was going pretty badly at the time. My sales were, if not in free fall, then let's put it this way: my publishers were not putting out the posh cookies when I came to visit. My English publishers, I pitched this idea to them, and they were pretty underwhelmed. And I just decided that I had to write the book anyway. Every now and then you get a story that you feel you have to tell. And my husband very sweetly agreed that, you know, even if it took me a year and we never saw anything from it, that I should just do it. And I did it. And something strange happened, which from the day it got published, it became that kind of nirvana for all writers, the word of mouth book. And it sold, and it's never really stopped selling. And I think worldwide now it's getting on for 6 million copies. Oh, thank you. I just want to say, I always love saying that to an American audience because you guys all clap, and if you say that to an English audience, they go, yeah, don't show off. So, so you're never quite sure how it's going to go. But it's been the most astonishing thing, and I've spent a good part of this year filming it with MGM, who bought the movie rights. And, oh God, you guys are so nice. Yeah, I'm never leaving Philadelphia now. That's it. I can show off here a lot, yeah. But that's been an amazing experience, watching the characters come to life. But what happened was, when you normally finish a book, you go through kind of a mourning period, because if you've done it right, or if you've even done it halfway right, you're really invested in your imaginary people, to the point where sometimes I hold conversations with them in my sleep, or at least that's what I tell my husband. And so usually you go through this period where you finish it, you really miss them kind of quite intensely for a while, and then you go through the edit process, at the end of which you hate them so much you would do anything to just let them go. I think it's a bit like having teenagers, you know. It's just, and then you move on to the next thing, and your brain is utterly consumed by the next book, and you can't even remember writing the one that you had behind. But what happened with this book is, unlike the 8 books that I wrote before this one, and that's not even going into the 3 unpublished ones, not bitter at all, people started writing to me about this book by email, by Twitter, by Facebook, and literally from the first week it came out, I had this extraordinary number of emails from people who wanted to tell me about their experience as caregivers, or their own experiences with family members who had wanted to die or who had died. And just often stories from young women who just felt that their lives lacked ambition and they didn't know how to get out of a rut. And so I kept answering these questions, and it never stopped. So Louisa was always in my head. She never left in the way that other characters did. And then I started work on the movie script because I adapted it. And again, she was in my head every day. And then finally I started asking myself the same question that people were asking me, which was, well, what would she have done? And often with my books, they start with an image. Me Before You started with an image of 2 people dancing in a wheelchair at a wedding in a kind of inappropriate manner. And the book kind of came out of that one image. And in this book, I had an image of Louisa walking along a parapet at night, over the top of a city, not planning to jump off or anything, not a suicidal image, but just to do with loneliness and being alienated from your surroundings. And as soon as I had that image, a plot came to me one morning, and I knew I had it. And I thought, well, this is going to be easy, because this is going to be the easiest book I ever wrote, because I love writing this character. I love writing all the characters who I was going to bring into it. I've got a plot. For once, I mean, for me, character is really hard. You really have to build them quite carefully. So I thought, this is going to be a doddle. Ha! It was so not a doddle. Because what happened is, when I wrote Me Before You, nobody had any expectations of me whatsoever. In fact, my husband used to joke, in a loving way, that it was going to be the book that finally killed my career. It was said lovingly, I promise. I used to agree with him. And this time, I kept hearing readers' voices, like critical voices, saying, oh, well, she wouldn't do that. You know, well, of course she wouldn't do that. And why would she do that? And she's doing what with him? And because she does do what with him. And that's not giving too much away. And it became almost paralyzing. And so what I had to do in the end, I had tea with another novelist, a woman called Marion Keyes, who I think some American people have read, who is a very, very wise and funny and generous-natured Irish woman. And I told her of the problem that I was having. And it was particularly high in my head that day because Louisa had just had sex with somebody else. Yeah, I'm sorry, she does. Come on, she went a whole book without having any kind of action at all. We had to give her something. She couldn't have gone 2 books. She's 28 years old. Anyway, and I told Marion this thing, and she just looked at me and she said, I'm not going to try the Irish accent because I've got a feeling there's going to be a few Irish people here who will stone me. She just said, Jojo, forget that. You cannot think about what anybody else says. You have to put yourself in a bubble. Just write the story you want to write. There's always going to be people who disagree with what she does or have opinions, and that's kind of good. You know, if people have strong opinions about your character, it means they care about them. But it was really liberating, and so obviously that was the point at which she ran away and joined the circus. No, not really. So yeah, I'm thinking of all sorts of mad things I could have just said then, which would have got me into all sorts of trouble. But no, she doesn't. But I did feel liberated enough to write my own story then, and there it is. And I finished it, and it's been truly terrifying. You know, you would think after writing 12 books and 2 novellas that it would get easier in some way, and it doesn't. It actually gets harder. And starting the book in the first place gets harder because you start thinking your way into all the things that could go wrong. And in fact, I was so slow getting going with this one that one of my editors actually emailed me and basically said, stop thinking and start writing. So I have stopped. I've tried to think and write, actually. That sounds terrible. But I've written it. This is I think, day 3 of it being out in the States. So I'm sure not many people have read it to the end so far, but I've had some really very kind reviews so far. And I hope if you read it, you enjoy it at least half as much as some of you enjoyed me before you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jojo. So we'll take some questions now. Raise your hand, I'll call on you, and we'll get a mic.
And don't be shy, or I will actually pick on you. I will just choose people to give me questions. Okay.
In the second row here.
It's lovely to see you. May I just say that you are younger than I expected. Only because there was such wisdom and love in the book. I'm interested, and I think all of us are, is who is in the movie. Tell us about that. Tell us how difficult or easy it was to adapt this wonderful book to a screenplay, and how has it been to be part of the movie making world?
Okay. I'm sure you all got that. I don't have to repeat the question. Okay, so I had never written a screenplay before MGM came knocking, and I hadn't expected to be asked to write the screenplay because my slim knowledge of Hollywood told me that it is the studio's worst nightmare, generally, to have the writer involved with the process. And I'm sure some of you know of some recent cases where it has been positively catastrophic, so the bar has been set pretty low for us. But I think the thing with Me Before You is it's such a fine balance between tragedy and comedy, and also the moral issues in play are very finely balanced, and I think they felt that they wanted to keep that tone, and they wanted me to be involved. And I had some help from some very fine screenwriters who basically looked at every draft that I produced, and the studio helped a lot and gave me notes at every stage of the process. And I think perhaps for me, because I see things cinematically when I write anyway, I'm not a writer who spends half a day crafting one sentence. I tend to run scenes through in my head cinematically until they work, and then I'll write them, and then I'll just polish and polish and polish over a period of months. I think for me it was probably easier to do an adaptation than maybe it would be for some other writers, but also because I was a journalist many years ago, and anyone who's been one will know that editors are not gentle in their editing process, and so I'm quite used to very direct criticism. So I'm not somebody who was going to get terribly upset. I do believe that an editor will generally always make something better, and these people knew about the movie business and I didn't. So for the most part, although we had some kind of fairly robust discussions at some part, I felt that we were all on the same page and we all wanted roughly the same vision of the film, which I think helped. As far as how it felt to be part of the process, it was the most fun ever. I'm not going to lie to you. You know, it was just fantastic. The best bit, the strangest bit, was the first day, which was I got invited along to what was called the pre-shoot, where they said, the two actors who play the leads. One is Sam Claflin from Hunger Games. He plays Will. The younger members of the audience tend to... My daughter immediately gasped when I said this. I didn't know who he was. He's a very, very beautiful and very... Sorry, did I say... He is beautiful. He is. You'll just stare at him. It was really tough. I just kind of did that for 3 months. Also a very good actor, obviously. But I got invited to this pre-shoot, and I got sent through all this documentation the day before, the call sheet, which I didn't know what it was. It was just like pages and pages of stuff. And I just thought, okay, I have to drive to here in the morning, be there for 8 o'clock. So drove along. There was this huge car park full of enormous white trailers, and then someone pulled up in a limo and said, okay, you need to get in the limo and come over here. So already I was like, I thought there was going to be sort of a few actors, a couple of cameras, maybe a dog, you know, just... And then I pull up into this area behind, in part of the city, the financial district of London, and there were kind of 8 streets shut off with security guards. There were 4 rain machines. There was a stunt bike. There was 120 crew. There were cameras everywhere. There was food trucks. There was ambulance, wardrobe. And I walked in, and, you know, someone was shouting, rain, you know, and it rained. And then... there was Will walking along the street in a very smart suit, talking into a phone, and it was just mind-blowing because I was like, okay, he doesn't just exist in here, he's walking along there. And it was really strange because it was like that instant realization that he was not my person anymore. He existed for all these people, and that some of them would be more expert on him than I was. And that was strange, but as soon as you can get past that little kind of mental hurdle, it's fascinating because you get to see actors speaking your words. And some of the actors, we had Charles Dance in it, who some of you may know, and a very fine theatrical actress called Janet McTeer playing his wife. And when you see those two arguing at full pelt, in character, I hasten to say, that would have been... an actress called Amelia Clark plays Louisa. She's better known as Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons in Game of Thrones. And you will see her, you'll be more familiar with her in a £20,000 wig, blonde wig. But in reality, she's small and dark, and she has this astonishing kind of warmth about her that she was a kind of a unanimous decision because everyone fell in love with her from the start. And I hope everybody feels when they see the film that she's a really good Lou. Thanks.
Another question.
Oh.
Yeah, in the pink and then further back.
Hi. Oh, wow, that's loud. I was surprised to see that you're always considered a romance writer. I consider you more of a character study. What do you consider yourself?
I have to be careful here because as the recipient of 2 awards, it kind of feels ungracious to say I'm not a romance writer. But I think the term that I struggle with is because people hear the words romance writer and they assume that you've written something formulaic, you know, in which this happens, that happens, the man is tall, dark and handsome, and then they all go off together into the sunset. And I don't know, I agree with you. I'd never thought of myself as writing romances. I think I write books that have an issue somewhere and also have a love story, but it's not always a love story between a man and a woman. It can be a love story between a mother and her child. It can be a love story between a person and their country, a man and a ship in one case. You know, you never know. It was really useful to me to win those awards at a time when my career was really doing very little, so I will always be grateful to them. But I struggle with the way that my books are often described. Interestingly, it's usually people who use terms like chick lit or romance writer are often people who haven't read them. So I just, you know, I nod and smile and go, life is good, I can't complain really. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh.
The book. Wanted to say that there were times when I was reading the first book when I had to put it down. It was just claustrophobic. The way that you describe his life, it's so intense. And I'm wondering, did you have to do the same when you were writing it? Because you got so deeply into his character that I thought at points, I don't know if I would have been able to finish writing that story myself.
Thank you. And yeah, I cried a lot while writing that book. I also made myself laugh a lot, which is kind of bad manners because you shouldn't admit to laughing at your own jokes. But the last few chapters, especially there's a letter that I wrote, which you will know if you've read the book, I cried so hard that the man in the office next to me, I rent an office above a hairdresser's, and the man in the office next to me knocked on the door to see if I was okay. And I had to say, I'm fine, I'm having a really good day. He's just like, it's going really well. And he was just like, okay. Just like, it's a very odd job. But I have found over the years, you know, having written quite a few books that I hope will make you feel claustrophobic or upset or funny or whatever, is that if I don't cry, you won't cry. And it's become a real litmus test. I can almost quiz people as to where they cried, and it will always be the points at which I cried, which I know is a kind of a weird way to earn a living. But it works for me. And if I write what I think is going to be a deeply emotional scene and I don't cry, then I worry. Yeah.
More questions? There's a gentleman in front here, and then we'll head 3/4 of the way back.
When I read an author who is writing several books with similar characters, similar theme, I always wonder, and first opportunity to ask the author, when you started the first book, did you have one theme and one book in mind, or did you have multiple themes that you knew you were going to jump from 1 to 2, and is there 3, is there 4?
No, I did not have a... I only knew that I wanted to write this story of what happened with this man. But unusually, this is one of the few books which didn't have a natural end to it in some ways, which might seem a little strange given if you know what happened. But one of the main reasons I've never considered a sequel before is because often the plots are quite intricate, and the effort involved in getting the characters together at the end is quite big or complicated. And I have this theory that because my characters tend to be quite complicated and flawed people, that if I revisit them in 5 years, they'll be split up or arguing over whose turn it is to unload the dishwasher. And so I've never really wanted to kind of open a door on what happened afterwards. But I just kept thinking, in this case, how would you walk away from being part of something so big? And I think as an ex-news journalist as well, I'm kind of fascinated by what happens to people after they were in the headlines. You know, you often hear about the bit players in huge stories and wonder, well, where did they go? And how much of that did they carry into the rest of their lives? And because the right to die is such a huge issue in our society, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but it's an issue that just doesn't go away in the UK because of this issue we have with prolonging life and yet not having an idea what to do with that life while we prolong it. These people keep coming into the news, and I got friendly with one family of a man who had tried very hard to end his own life through the courts and then ended up dying a truly awful death. Despite the best efforts of his family, his 2 daughters and his wife, who were campaigning on his behalf. Even though they loved him passionately, they knew that this was, you know, he'd been a really fit, sporty guy, and this was not how he wanted to live. And I've been interested to see what happened to them. They've actually ended up carrying on his fight because they can't let it go. And I suppose that, of all the books, has led to my own desire to do a sequel. I actually have envisaged doing 3. Once I knew I wanted to do 2, I actually want to write a 3rd. But the plot isn't kind of fully fleshed out in my mind yet, so it won't be soon. It won't be any time soon. And it will only happen if I think I can make the plot strong enough. But no, it's never. But it's quite fun. It just takes a huge... It's pleasurable revisiting characters that you like writing, yeah.
Lady in back on our left. Yep, Mimi, right in front of you there.
Oh, sorry. Hi, it's great to hear you talk and appreciate your wit as well as your sincerity. One question I had with your journalism background, maybe research, you know, different things like that, did you consider having a different ending?
To me before you?
Yes.
Okay, all the people who haven't read it, you need to stick your fingers in your ears now. I'm really sorry. Or perhaps you'll just forget what I said. Shall I answer this? Okay. The answer is yes. I did consider a different ending. When I start a book, I have a rough plot in my head, and then I just break it down so that every time I start a chapter, I have maybe a paragraph worth of notes to just guide me as to what needs to happen at any time. But something really interesting happened when I wrote this book, which is, again, unlike other books that I've written. The characters had such chemistry that I knew exactly how they would respond to each other and to any given situation, wherever I put them. And that made it really fun to write. And the more I did this, and the more they kind of warmed to each other, I kind of didn't want to let that go. And I got to about, 80% of the way through. And I thought, I can't do this. I can't end the book in the way that I planned to. So I rang my agent and I said, I've had an idea about this book that I'm writing, and you know the ending I said we were going to do? Well, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to do a book with two endings, one happy, one not so happy, and then the readers can choose which direction they want to go. And we can do it as a kind of marketing gimmick, and we can advertise the fact that it's a whole new kind of book, and it's going to be really interesting. And there was this long silence on the other end of the phone, and then I'm not going to tell you exactly what she said to me, but it was along the lines of grow a pair. And she said, just do the ending you were planning to do. And so I did the ending I was planning. And I have to say, with hindsight, I don't think this book would have sold 1 million copies if it had ended with a kind of Hollywood ending, if you like. I think part of the reason that this book has been successful is because it sticks with people for that reason. But that said, the more I've thought about it, I have occasionally thought about just writing my own alternate ending, just for personal use. I might just put it out on the internet and let people find it. You'll just have to forget about the sequel. Yeah.
So I assume the movie will keep the ending.
We had it in the contract, I think, that they couldn't change the ending.
A few more questions? Yeah, about 5 rows back here. And then Mimi, did you see somebody?
So I'm a big fan of audiobooks, and I'm already on the waiting list to get your new book. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering, do you read the audiobook yourself, or who does read?
Oh, no, it's an actor. It's a real skill. I couldn't do an audiobook, but I love listening to them. I'm always given test samples of the actors' voices to see if I think that they sound like the actors in my head, if they sound like the voices in my head, you know. And what's really interesting to me about audiobooks is that, I told you about these relatives that we had that required a lot of care, and one of them was in a care home that was the best part of 3 hours from my house, and it was always a really miserable journey, and there's something about radio that I find a bit exhausting on long journeys. So because I don't have many audiobooks, I used to listen to my own audiobooks going to and from, out of curiosity really, to see if they were good. And I can remember occasions where the acting was so good on these audiobooks that I would be sitting driving going, what's going to happen next? And then you go, I wrote the book. I know what's going to happen next. But it's that thing where it stops becoming your story and they bring something completely different to it. And I think apart from one book, which I'm not going to tell you which one it is, but where the male romantic lead, for want of a better expression, seems to have been played by somebody 40 years older than I had pictured, with a kind of gruff voice. And it's just like, how did, the Kentucky Fried Chicken man, how did he end up as my romantic lead? What happened? But for the most part, I absolutely love them. And I think one of the ones that's had loads of compliments lately is 1+1, which is read by 4 or 5 different actors, and they are all fantastic. So, I love them. If I had more driving time, I would listen to more, but I'm a bit of a podcast addict at the moment.
Back in the middle there.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. It's sort of a two-part question. Does the family of the rugby player know that drove you to write this story, or me before you, know how influential their family story was in your writing? And if so, have you ever spoken with them, or do they have any feedback or anything?
Usually when I write a book, I do a lot of research, and I wrote a book about an aircraft carrier. I spent time aboard an aircraft carrier, and, when I wrote about First World War in France, I traveled around France. In this case, I read all around the news reports of this case, and I realized that the parents weren't talking. They didn't give interviews. They seemed to be very private people. And my gut feeling was that they had been through something so harrowing that I didn't want to even risk adding to their pain by asking them lots of questions about the experience. So I basically just did it from my imagination. But a weird thing happened when we were filming, which is that we had a spinal injuries advisor, a woman who worked at a very famous spinal injuries hospital called Stoke Mandeville. And it turns out she'd treated this young man. And it was, I can't remember if I asked her if his family had stayed in touch, but I did meet one of his friends who is also a spinal injuries patient, and he came onto set a few times. And I think the thing that they felt was that we had fairly represented the life of a spinal injuries patient and the trials and the kind of dark comedy in it. And it was very interesting for me to get a little window from her into his life as well. So I'm kind of wary of saying too much publicly, given what I've already said about how I think his parents probably want to be private. But no, that was one of the few cases in which I've never approached somebody, and I still don't know if it was the right decision, but my gut says it was the right decision. So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think it was the right decision for all of you to join us this evening in Philadelphia. Please join me in thanking Jojo Moyes.
Thank you.
Where do you want me to go? I'll take you back here.